A boiling hot afternoon, I stood looking down on the skating rink in front of the Rockefeller Center on Fifth Avenue. On a 14 days visit to New York, it was the 13th day I had tried to get my foot in the door to see managers in advertising agencies on Lexington and Fifth Avenue to show them my unique new design, but no one was interested. 40 degrees in the shade, and my tie felt like strangling me. Looking up at the Rockefeller Center, I saw a huge sign saying Standard Oil, and desperate, running out of time, I took the lift up to the 26th floor. As the lift doors opened, a receptionist was sitting at a desk next to the door to Standard Oil's office. I introduced myself and said, "May I see the Vice President for 5 minutes, please? I have a unique invention that he will not reject." She stared at me as if I was a ghost, hesitated and said, "One moment, sir," took my brown paper bag with my unique cube calendar design and left. A few moments later, she came back and said, "Go through that door. You have exactly 5 minutes to explain yourself." Standing behind a large desk, as he turned around, I said, "Standard Oil could be the first in the world to use my unique design for promotion." Hesitating a moment, he said, "I will buy 52. While my hope plunged, he continued, "One calendar for each of our 52 companies around the world, and instruct them to order 1,000 each." He then called a friend and told him to see me the next day, my very last day. And he ordered 2,000 calendars. Feeling elated, I bought a nice brown leather case that I've still got and threw away the brown paper bag. From that day on, I never looked back until now. Life is a gamble. The biggest prize we can win is life itself, and being born to caring parents that gives us a good start in life. The picture chiseled into my mind was the 9th of April 1940, about 3 in the afternoon. It was in Esbjerg on the west coast of Jutland, Denmark. I was 3 at the time. I came out of a cinema with my mother, who had taken me to see Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck cartoons. We heard drumming noises, and looking up, the sky was covered with what I thought was huge black noisy birds. Later my mother told me that it was in fact German bombers that flew in over Denmark as part of Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg occupation of Denmark. In the winter of 1942-43, my parents decided to move over to Copenhagen. Under the German occupation, fuel and rubber was all taken by the German army, so the only transport my father could find was a little old lorry that had a cylindrical gas generator fixed to the back, in which he was burning wood that was converted into gas and connected to the engine. Consequently, half the back was taken up by blocks of wood and the remaining space taken up by our few belongings, and every so often my father had to stop and fill up the stove so we could drive on. We set off in January 1943, driving the short distance over Jutland to the island of Fyn, passing over the little belt bridge, which had German guards positioned at each end of the bridge. Even only 5 years old, I still see a picture in my mind of the German guard asking for our identity cards. We continued across Fyn to the Big Belt, where we faced a serious hurdle because the sea had frozen solid across to Zealand My father decided to drive south along the coast until he found a place where he could drive our little lorry down to a beach and out on the ice. He checked the thickness of the ice and chanced it. We got across and eventually arrived to Copenhagen a day later. The liberation of Denmark followed 2 years later, the 5th of May, 1945. I now skip forward to the start of my education at 16. I was determined to become a racing driver, but my father insisted on a proper education, so I decided to become a building engineer stroke architect. I chose the combination of apprenticeship and studying at evening school for 4 years and never regretted it. Numerous times I've found my education extremely useful. I finished my apprenticeship at 19 and a year later finished my study and received my diploma in 1960. Having completed my education, the following 5 years I pursued my motor racing activities while maturing somewhat, and at 25 I felt I had to choose between becoming a full-time professional racing driver or take up my original education, and I chose the latter. In 1964, Ford Motor Company hired me to their sales promotion and public relation department, where I was to promote the Ford Mustang and the Ford GT. 2 years later, in 1966, I was offered the job as advertising and public relations manager for a new charter airline called Internord, being responsible for the airline magazine and the development of charter destinations in southern Europe. Internord was operating a fleet of DC-7 4-engine propeller planes, and in 1967 proceeded to buy the extremely fast Coronado 4-engine jet from American Airlines. With the chief pilot, we flew to American Airlines headquarters in Tulsa, Texas, to collect the plane empty, without seats, and flying it back to Denmark while doing the publicity about the acquisition. I remember sitting on a Coca-Cola box in the cockpit behind the pilots. The rather daring Swedish chief pilot decided to test the maximum speed of the plane while we were cruising over the Atlantic, and we broke through the sound barrier at over 1,400 kilometers per hour, taking only about 6 hours from Boston to Oslo in Norway. Once in Denmark, the plane was fitted out with seats according to the configuration chosen by Internord, and I arranged a publicity flight for 120 journalists to a dinner party at the Lido in Paris, which resulted in about 800 millimeters of publicity in the papers. Meanwhile, after only about a year at Internord, my private life took me to California, bringing with me a new idea, a model of a calendar based on 2 cubes, however, needing 13 numbers combined to set 31 dates. I realized that using the number 6, both as a 6 or as a 9, made it possible to combine the 12 sides to set the dates from 01 to 31. I hurried back to Denmark and got a joiner to hand-build a sample true to size, exactly as if it had been manufactured. So now we are up to date with my first sales trip to New York in July 1968, as reported at the start of this film. Upon my return from New York, I founded Copenhagen Creative Workshop Limited and borrowed £5,000 from my father, who set tough conditions. Return of the money within 6 months at 10% interest or 50% of the company shares. The construction of the steel molds took 3 months. The mass production, including silk screening, took 1 month. The shipping time, including delivery of the 52,000 calendars and receipt of payment from Standard Oil, took 2 months. So I just made it within 6 months and returned the money to my father with 10% interest. A year later, I had sold over 1 million calendars worldwide. As it had now become known worldwide, I was invited as part of a Danish design delegation to Moscow by the Soviet Cultural Minister Futseva to exhibit the calendar in Russian language at the Technical Museum in Moscow over Christmas, New Year 1969-70. Landing in Moscow in -15, snowing heavily, we were met by a government delegation and driven to the old Hotel Metropole. I remember drinking Russian champagne and eating blinis filled with black caviar on New Year's Eve. Walking a bit tipsy across the Red Square at 2 o'clock in the morning in -25, I passed the Lenin Mausoleum. I created some unusual leaflets and sales catalogs, like the one with the globe and the head chopped off my girlfriend, the one with the Aztec sundial calendar. All the while I continued creating a number of innovative designs, including the slide rule pencil cup, today exhibited in museums both in Australia and USA, the metric converter pencil cup, a huge success in the USA in 1972 when they went metric, and the easy calendar that received an Oscar in France for the best publicity design in 1974. The Macy and May department stores in the US put me on the front of their sales bulletin and sold my calendar in all their stores in America. Many more designs followed, and I went on a 21-day selling trip to the US, where I had meetings in 21 states and cities with invites from the vice presidents of Goodyear Tire Company and the Riker Pharmaceutical Laboratories in California, among others. The advertising manager for John Player's special in England flew to Copenhagen in their black and gold Learjet to meet and asking me to create several designs, including 2 types of cigarette boxes in the black and gold livery with their JPS logo. I also did a design for Philip Morris based in Lausanne, Switzerland. It was a small cigarette lighter looking exactly like their pack of cigarettes. They proposed to buy 1 million at 50 cents each. So I flew immediately to Tokyo, where they said that they could possibly make them for 50 cents each. But at that price, I would not have any profit, so I had to decline the order. I designed a similar version for John Player, but with no success. You can't win them all. Even having applied and got a copyright on the calendar in Rome in 1970, copies started appearing in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And I realized that with any future of my designs, I only had about a year of fast selling before I would be copied. The calendar has since been copied in 44 odd countries and are still selling now 53 years later in a variety of materials and shapes. Having achieved considerable success, I opened an office in Italy in 1971 that was part of the 6 nations in the EEC in order to save duty selling from Denmark and allowing manufacturing there. I rented the first floor in the Grand Palazzo by the lakeside in Como, north of Milan, and put one of my employees there to control our manufacturing in the industrial area of Milan. I allowed myself to buy the powerful BMW 3-liter CS Coupe driving down once a month to check that things were running okay, often driving 1,000 kilometers through the night. Regrettably, our Italian manufacturing did not last long. Having received an order of 500,000 metric converter pencil cups from the US pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly, and with full capacity in Copenhagen, I decided to produce the metric converters in Milan. After 3 months, the steel molds were still not ready. I got seriously worried. I called Peter, my employee in Como, and asked him to rent a small pickup truck and have it ready at 6 a.m. I drove down overnight, chancing that there would only be a guard present at the factory. We arrived at 6:30 a.m. I told the guard that the main office had agreed that I could collect my molds, which I had already paid for. The guard calling the main office got no reply and decided to believe me. We loaded the steel molds and drove off as fast as we could. Peter knew of a tiny road passing through the mountains into Switzerland, where we put the molds in my car and drove straight back to Denmark. I justified to take possession of my steel molds in this dramatic way in order to try and save this huge order. I flew the steel molds to Connecticut, USA, where a local manufacturer finished them and started production. Eli Lilly required quality control, and regrettably, their engineer reported back that the quality was not acceptable, so fate would have it, Eli Lilly cancelled the order. During those extremely busy years, I decided to learn to fly and got a private pilot's license that nearly resulted in me falling out of the sky. The story goes like this. Always looking for interesting opportunities, I became interested in getting the concessions for Scandinavia for the small Italian single-engine aircraft CI Machetti. It was extremely fast, had a stick instead of a hand rudder, and only 2 single seats. The European headquarters was in Charleroi, Belgium, so I decided to hire a 4-seater Cessna 172 and fly to Charleroi. I had been close to death twice in my life, twice in motor racing and the third time while flying. I had an employee who also had a pilot license, so one bright morning we made our flight plan, including weather report, and took off. In those days, GPS was not yet invented, so flying VFR, Visual Flight Rules, we used our radio license to report our position to the radio beacons along our route. Over Groningen in Holland, we encountered an unexpected strong headwind that not only slowed us down, but it made us use more fuel. Having reached Antwerp, we radioed flight control in Brussels to get permission to land. They told us that the airport was busy and we had to hold over Antwerp until they called us in. After half an hour, we became quite anxious, called flight control again and told them that if they did not permit us to come in now, we would run out of fuel. Really worried, with very little fuel left, I told my son Thomas in the back to help look for fuels to make an emergency landing, and I decided to switch off fuel feed from the left wing tank. And after 12 minutes, the right wing tank was empty. So opening again the left tank, we now knew that we had only 12 minutes left before we would fall out of the sky. We were now over the city of Brussels, and there was nowhere to make an emergency landing. Ahead to the right, I could see the airport in the far distance. And as we approached the runway, an Alitalia passenger plane was approaching as well. I swung our little plane in right behind and beneath the Alitalia aircraft, and we landed just behind it. The air traffic controllers were screaming at us, but we took no notice as we were running out of fuel completely when we turned off the main runway. Having parked our little Cessna 172, I went to the control tower with my logbook, and they were shouting at me. Quietly, I sternly reminded them that it was no thanks to them that we were still alive, as they had instructed us to hold over Antwerpen and forgotten us. So only by our own action did we survive. No further comment necessary. After refueling, we had just half an hour flight to Charleroi, and I need to say my interest had waned considerably. Even after taking a risk in your life, and if you fail, there's no need to understand yourself differently, because if you have the desire to achieve your goal, then failure will not harm you, and one day you will eventually succeed, knowing that you have achieved all you set out to do. It all started with a crash in 1959. My interest in motor racing went back long before that, to the time when my parents took me to the London Festival in 1951. I was 14 and had eyed a little model racer in a shop window next to our hotel in Russell Square, London. It was powered by a rocket engine, and I bought it with my pocket money. However, those model cars were peanuts in comparison with a real car. So in the winter 1957-58, on my way to work on my Lambretta scooter, I was passing a service station every morning, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a Morgan Plus 4 1951 parked outside and in a sorry state. One morning, I went in, asked about it, was told that the Swede had left it, never paid for the repair, and that I could have it if I paid for the repair. That's how I got my first car. Later, I drove it to Sweden and sold it with a handsome profit. Now in the money, I bought an old Ford Anglia 1951 in a scrapyard, put it in our garden to my father's despair, stripped the body off the chassis and fitted an Ashley glass fiber sports body imported from England. The result was a pretty sports car that I sold and now had money to go racing. In the meantime, a friend of mine had an old MG TC 1939, which needed complete restoration. So as 17-year-olds, we set out to do just that, and the experience taught me a lot about the mechanics that became in handy later. Now 19-year-old, we decided to build our own Formula Junior car. As the Saloon Car Championship in Denmark 1958 had been won with a Nardi Fiat 1100cc, we bought it to use as a donor car and built our own car during the winter 1958-1959. We fitted the engine, transmission, suspension, electrics, the rack and pinion steering, the wheels, and mounted it all on a light tubular chassis welded together by a flight mechanic that we knew and who also helped us to shape and clad the chassis with an aluminium body, and were ready in May 1959 with our Nardi Fiat Formula Junior racing car weighing just 500 kilos. My friend Erik and I had agreed to take the car to the racing track, Roskilde Ring, to test it, and the one of us that did the fastest lap times should drive the car in the first race, the 6th of June 1959. However, building the car all on our own and having no experience in engineering, we had not realized that fitting a suspension made for a car weighing 1100 kilos to a car that weighed 500 kilos, the steering would be very difficult. Come race day, being a fast car and I determined to win, I actually managed to lead into the first long bend, and reaching 130 km, I lost control through the second bend, flipped over and came to a halt with a broken arm, a 7-centimeter hairline crack in my skull, and 3 months in hospital. Needless to say, I learned the hard way. Undaunted and determined, having acquired a supercharged Austin Healey Sprite with a special aluminium body and racing it at Roskilde Ring in September 1960, I won the Danish Championship for sports cars up to 3000 cc in 1960. That led to a job as reserve driver and mechanic in 1961 with Team Speedwell in England. After a year in England, racing my Team Speedwell Sprite in races among other at Goodwood, I returned to Denmark for the 1962 season as first team driver for the Mini Cooper factory team, in addition to driving my own Lola Formula Junior. In 1963, I swapped the Lola for a Lotus 17 sports racing car, sold that in 1964 while hired as private team driver in a Lotus 18 Formula Junior, and in 1965, realizing that I now had to make a choice between being a full-time racing driver or build a serious business career, I chose the latter and stopped driving round in circles. Still having motor racing in my blood, my first little venture was driving my Mini Cooper 1275cc to a company in England who specialized in converting the Mini in what they called a mini sprint, lowering the roof, fitting doors, bonnet and boot lid in aluminium, and tuning up the engine. I now had a mini sprint and negotiated a dealership from Scandinavia, and it was published in the newspapers and magazines, receiving many inquiries. We now fast forward to 2002. Having never forgotten my motor racing, I acquired a Jaguar C-Type 1953, being a reconstruction of the original, needing only a light restoration. Having finished my C-Type, I went into partnership with a Riley specialist friend, and from a bare chassis he had, we reconstructed a Riley Big 4 1937, a beautiful car that we sold successfully the day it was ready. While completing that, I had become interested in several old French racing cars from the 30s. The Delahaye Type 135 CS, the Delage 7S, the Bugatti Type 135, and the Talbot Lago Type 150 SS. Having found a rare Delahaye Type 168 from 1939 in a forest in Germany, and two Delage 1937, but still not one correct to use as a donor car, I finally found a Delahaye chassis Type 138 from 1935, which had the right chassis for what was to become my Delahaye Type 138/135 CS 2 years later. So here follow the story of the reconstruction of my Delahaye. I found the Delahaye hidden away in a garage in Normandy, buried to the roof in plastic sheets and boxes full of dismantled parts, etc. Checking the engine, the chassis number, and the original Delahaye badge, I bought the car on the spot and had it shipped to my Riley friend in Leicester the following week. Meanwhile, I bought the old so-called Delahaye Bible, a 300-page book that included pages of information and pictures about the only 4 1935 Delahaye 138 sports racers ever produced, and I luckily found an original factory drawing that became invaluable to my whole reconstruction project. After the car had been shipped to the workshop of my friend, I flew over and immediately stripped the car down to the bare chassis and engine. As the Type 138 saloon car chassis was 3 meter and 15 centimeter long, and the Type 138 sports racer was 2 meter 84 centimeters, I had to shorten the chassis, so I brought it to another friend of mine who cut out 31 centimeters from the middle section and realigned and re-welded the chassis. Now the chassis had the original correct length. I needed to replace the old radiator with a shorter and thicker core in aluminium, and having had that made and fitted above the old oil cooler, it was the turn to replace the old steel plate wheels with wire wheels correct in rim size and number of spokes. That operation proved to be much more complicated than anticipated, as the old wheel hubs were entirely different to the new wire wheel hubs needed in order to accommodate the wire wheels and had to be especially made to order. Still, having succeeded, I now had a ready chassis in dark blue with engine, radiator and wire wheels fitted, so it was time to replace the single Solex carburetor with 3 fitted on double aluminium inlet manifolds. It took me several months to find them among Delahaye owners in France. Having finally succeeded, I had the old exhaust manifold sandblasted and mounted it all to the engine. Having lowered the radiator, the old water pump was sitting much too high on the engine and needed to be replaced. With no spares available, I contacted the network of Delahaye owners again, and one, the old commissioner at the Le Mans, had once 5 lowered water pumps manufactured in aluminium, and luckily had one left that I bought. Then the old dynamo had to be sent away for renovation, and the single radiator fan was replaced with a 6-wing fan. Finally, the original steering wheel of 45 centimeters in diameter had to be replaced with the correct period one, and I luckily found an original of 43 centimeters in diameter. An important junction had been reached in the reconstruction, as my Delahaye was now ready for making the aswood frame necessary to be clad with the aluminium body later. I had been recommended a person in Derby who specialized building ash frames for old cars. It is absolutely vital to build the ash frame to the right measurements, because the proportions and shape of the frame decide the shape of, for example, the height of the frame at the bulkhead in relation to the radiator frame in order to get a pretty slope to the bonnet. I decided on a decline of 1.5 inch mid to front, in addition to making many other calculations, and hope that I got them all right. It was now the turn of making and shaping the instrument panel in aluminium and fitting the 6 period instruments: the rev counter, the speedometer, the water temperature, the oil pressure, the oil temperature, and the amp meter gauges. The car was now ready for the aluminium body to be made and fitted. I was recommended a guy up in Cheshire. I went to see him and brought the car with me. Shaping the aluminium around the ash frame requires great skill, and a beautiful body soon took shape. The way I had designed the rear end, where the spare wheel was to be fitted, the lid was extremely difficult to shape, as it had to slope in all directions in order to appear as part of the body when fitted. Nevertheless, to my great satisfaction, it was successfully crafted and the body was ready. Now I brought the car to a seat maker, and I chose a thick leather in a light Bordeaux color. A spare wheel spinner to hold the spare wheel in place under the boot cover was fitted, and the radiator frame was shortened and rechromed. Finally, I had designed the wings according to the pictures in the Delahaye book, and got the specialist wingman to make them in aluminium. Fitted, the car now started matching the picture that I had been in my mind all along. The only electric diagram I could find was in the Delahaye book for a Type 148. But as it was from the same period, I gave it to another friend who knew about electrics, and he did a beautiful job fitting all the wires, etc., to the bulkhead, the old rechromed lights front and rear, and connecting it all to the dynamo and the engine. Last, the aero screens and side mirrors were fitted, and the car was now ready for painting of the body. I had been recommended a good car painter. He did an excellent job painting it in the blue racing colors of France, and a little toolbox in mahogany were fitted. Finally, the great moment, starting the engine for the first time and test the car. The engine and the sump had been flushed through with a special cleaning fluid, the valves and carburetors adjusted, so holding my breath, turning the key, would it start? Bearing in mind that it had not been started for the best of 70 years, after 4 tries, it fired up to my great relief, and bar some adjustments, it sounded okay. Having started the reconstruction in April 2009, the car was finally finished in July 2011 and registered 860 YUD. I entered the Delahaye in Bonham's September sale 2011, and it was successfully sold to a buyer from California. Shortly after, he entered the car in a major concours competition, and it won first prize. I loved my Delahaye, and I was so proud. I finally found a complete original 1936 Delahaye Type 135 competition, Coupe des Alpes, that once participated in the Monte Carlo Rally, and it needed only a cosmetic restoration. It was a gorgeous car that helped somewhat to balance the budget once it were sold. A Jaguar 3.8 S 1964 were the next project, followed by an Alfa Romeo Spider 2-liter 1974. Those were the last historic cars that I restored, as by now I had reached the ripe old age of 80. Loyalty has always been paramount to me. It was certainly poignant when I started my active engagement with the horses. An intensive period that lasted 11 years from 1974 to 1985. It was not at all a dance on roses. While giving me joyous as well as sad moments, but always fueled by the love of racing and breeding them. Being born and given life is the greatest gift to all living species. So it can be an unforgettable experience having been present at the birth of 11 foals, like a miracle every time, all bred from my mares in foal to various well-bred stallions. To get this story started, it is necessary to go back to my years as a boy of around 10 years old. We lived in a wonderful house on the edge of a very large forest called Dyrehaven, north of Copenhagen, and our only neighbor was a racehorse stable, which invariably meant that each morning, when I was ready to cycle to school, I watched a string of racehorses passing our gate, heading for a back gate into a racecourse that was on the other side of our property. Having become fascinated watching the racehorses, our father was kind enough to buy a pony for me, my brother and sisters, and I learned to ride. Even the time was fully engaged with my interest in motor racing, learning to play the piano, and subsequent professional education. I still did not forget the horses, but it was to be many years before I could afford to buy my first racehorse. In fact, I was 36 when that finally happened. I had bought my first property, a lovely old 18th century farm called Madelung Farm with 36 acres in 1969. And having spent a year restoring it completely, including building stables, etc., I acquired a 3-year-old horse to ride every day and a Dartmoor pony for my 10-year-old son Thomas. I called it Sesson. Lacking experience with horses, I had left the 3-year-old thoroughbred horse with the little Dartmoor pony in the same paddock, only to discover 11 months later that she gave birth to a rather large foal that we called Bambi. Little did I know that he would later play an important role among the other horses in the paddock. I then started looking for a racehorse, and to get advice, I went back to the stable where I had watched the racehorses as a boy and discovered that it still existed. So I went in and asked them for advice. Having told them where my farm was situated, they suggested that I contacted a trainer by the name Neundorf. He was actually German, who was training their 2-year-olds, and that he was situated not far from my farm. So I went to see him, and as I have always been a hands-on person, I hired him to teach me to race ride. And if I succeeded and got his approval, I would buy my first racehorse from him. After a year of learning the trade, so to speak, and race riding, one day in the spring of 1974, Neundorf presented me with a 3-year-old filly called Avaramour. Not very tall, about 15 hands, but somehow, even lacking experience, I was drawn to her and bought her. Here I should explain that the old way of measuring the height of a horse was by putting one hand on top of the other hand until one reached the height over the shoulder of the horse. Now I had to decide on my racing silks for the jockey to ride her in the first race. And since my motor racing days, I was fond of the checkered flag in white and black squares, so I decided to have my horse racing silks made in the black and white check, like the flag, and I bought a horse trailer for transporting my horses to the races. Coming race day in June 1974, I was naturally excited and worried for my horse that I had come to like very much in a short space of time. Needless to say, although being a smallish filly, she had a great heart and courage, and she won her first race for me. That year she continued to win race after race, and I felt lucky. However, it is a bit of a ruse to win one's first few races, because one gets easily used to winning, and when the wins suddenly stop coming, which they invariably will, it's a bit of a downer, but more about that later. Having got the taste of winning in 1975 and 76, I went over to attend to several of the auction house Tattersall's sales in Newmarket, using Timeform as a guide, and bought several horses. Among them, Cheeky, a 3-year-old horse, Petitioner, a lovely 3-year-old filly, and the 5-year-old horse, Verdant Green. I decided to ride Cheeky in his first race in Denmark. Having no experience jumping him out of the starting stalls, I just sat on Cheeky in the stalls and waited. So when the starter let the doors open, all the horses jumped forward except Cheeky with silly me on his back, resulting in us being about 15 lengths behind as we approached the first bend. However, Cheeky being a strong horse, we had soon caught up, but we had to race on the outside in 6th position around the bend. So Cheeky had to run a lot longer than most of the other horses. And we finished 5th overall. Realizing that I could have won the race, it taught me how little experience I really had, but also that I had a great horse. Cheeky went on to win 5 sprint races with professional jockeys in 1975 and 76. And in 1977, I raced him in Compiègne in France, where he finished 3rd. Since being 8 years old at the end of the Second World War, I had always wanted to move to England one day. I had bought a large estate in West Sussex called Hunbus Manor Estate. We arrived there the 1st December 1977, and 1 month later, my daughter Celine was born. I quickly learned that in England, many of the fields are separated by hedges rather than fences. I soon cut out a jump course, trimming some hedges as hurdles for the horses to jump, and I applied to the Jockey Club in London for a temporary horse trainer's jump and steeplechase license to start with. This was later replaced with a professional license for flat racing that continued throughout the years 1980 and 1985. So after a year, I decided to sell, and I bought a very nice property called Summerhill, where my youngest son Oliver was born shortly after. However, there were no stables, so I immediately built the necessary stable block for all the horses and fenced in the paddocks for the mares with their foals. Not only had I become increasingly interested in the breeding of thoroughbred horses, but the fact that the winners now became far and few between, I realized that there were a better and happier way of making ends meet by concentrating more on sending my mares to good pedigree stallions and breeding foals that I could sell at auctions in Newmarket as yearlings. Consequently, I bought Topsin from France, a good pedigree stallion, in order that we could do in-house breeding with our mares. Now, having the professional trainer's license and got horses in training for clients, I needed better training facilities than I had at Summerhill. So in 1981, I decided to sell and bought Battlebarn Farm with 36 acres near Settlescombe, East Sussex. I built a stable block and constructed a 1,200 meter long all-weather gallop that enabled me to train the horses efficiently and professionally. You are here watching the grainy old video footage that I filmed during a morning training in 1983. While we watched the second lot out, I want to tell a little story about a very fast horse called Telecommunication. He was a 5-year-old gelding that had won several races, but he had been rather mistreated as a young horse, and he was extremely difficult to handle in his box. When one entered, he would turn his back and start kicking. Not knowing quite how to handle him, I thought of my children's pony, Bambi, bred earlier in Denmark. I had noticed that when Bambi was out in the paddock with other horses, he seemed to be master. So one day I put Bambi alone in the paddock and managed to catch telecommunication, his box, drag him out and let him loose in the paddock with Bambi. His ears went flat back, a sign of hostility and anger, and he galloped straight for Bambi. However, this strong pony turned his back and started kicking with his hind legs, going like drumsticks. So after a few seconds, this big horse stood shaking like a lamb. After that, we never had any problems with him. Like human beings, horses can be moody. Some days they are in good spirits, other days not so. They get ill or have accidents. They continuously need kind attention and cared for. We look after them and come to love them. So when bad things happen, we are extremely saddened. It was an intensive and emotional period of my life that I loved dearly. Riding out early every morning, exercising the horses, breaking in the yearlings, and my daily relationship with them. I especially enjoyed the exciting time of having my mares brought in foal to the various stallions and waiting anxiously the 11 months for the foals to be born, often sitting up half the night to assist a mare when she was ready to deliver her foal and see the light of day. A wonderful time with lots of fun memories that I will treasure forever. I will begin with the end, showing here the first test sailing of MS Bel Air in September 2006, after we had launched her the 13th of June 2006, and then finished some interior details in the months in between. On board, beside myself, was the crew of 3, the captain, a sailor, and the cook, in addition to my brother Jacob and my daughter Celine. So here goes my story. In January 1998, I had rented a 4-bedroom villa with magnificent views to the sea halfway up the mountainside in Aise-Bord-Mer. Driving from Nice, one passes Villefranche, then Beaulieu-sur-Mer, and then one arrives at Aise-Bord-Mer. Situated 427 meters above is the medieval Aise village, halfway between Nice and Monaco, where I had my office apartment. During the first 6 years, I tried to persuade the owner to sell the villa to me, and in January 2003, I finally succeeded. At that time, nothing was further from my mind than getting involved in building a sailing yacht. I negotiated a good price on the villa, and my bank in Monaco verbally accepted my request for a loan to complete the purchase. I signed the contract on the villa, but 3 weeks later, the bank called and said they could not provide the loan because they had not realized that I would be too old to insure before the end of the term of the loan. I was greatly disappointed, so that is the main reason I came to build MS Bel Air. In that period, I had received a circular email from a Turkish yacht agency called Satco Yachting, offering a 24-meter motor sailing yacht for sale, and it made me think, why not have a look at this boat? I booked tickets to fly to Bodrum, Turkey, and asked my son Oliver to come with me. We sailed with the yacht the short distance of 9 kilometers from Bodrum to the Greek island of Kos, I inexplicably threw caution to the wind and did not check the people of the yacht agency. I would build a new one and asked him to set up a contract. It's crazy but true. But no risk, no gain. As I said earlier, everything happens for a reason. Sadko hired space for the construction in a shipyard situated by the beach 15 kilometers south of Bodrum. I had required that the hull should be constructed in steel, so they got a specialist to come from a large shipyard in Istanbul to start the construction, which commenced in April 2004. I hired a naval architect and marine engineer, and having set up a construction agreement with Sadko stipulating the maximum price with a budget limit and various conditions including a time limit for the completion of the yacht, the project started. Here are the details of my first design, color scheme and the steel construction, trials and tribulations that I had to overcome throughout the construction. I followed the progress of the construction closely and started flying to Bodrum from May 2004, sometimes twice a month, the next 2 years. And already 3 months into the construction, I started getting worried, as when I came in July, no one was working on the hull, and by October there was only a hollow shell in steel standing in the yard. After many calls and emails, they assured me that work would progress faster over the winter. By November 2004, I suspected that they were going to exceed not only the time limit, but also the budget. However, now there was only one way, and that was forward. In the summer of 2005, they requested it necessary to buy in more teak for the deck and mahogany for the cladding of cabins, etc. As we had already bought 52 tons of Class 1 mahogany, I questioned why they needed more teak and mahogany, and I discovered that a lot of the wood had been stolen. So in the end, I probably paid twice for what was needed. An ocean-going yacht of 30 meters and 94 tons is like a house. It must be self-sustaining in every way, and a decision had to be made on the length and weight of the main mast, 25 meters, and the mizzen mast of 23 meters. While I was busy negotiating with Caterpillar, buying 2 engines, each of 360 horsepower, 2 large generators, 37 kilowatts, 18 large batteries, and a water maker producing 150 liters an hour, converting salt water to fresh water. In addition to numerous items like a gangway called a passarella, furniture, washing machine, kitchen equipment, etc., etc., etc. Many additional delays and costs of materials continued 2005-2006, and by the time Bel Air was ready to launch, a veritable nightmare was presented to me by the owner of the shipyard, who refused to launch Bel Air because he was, unknown to me, owed 10,000 euros by Sadko. I was presented with a fait accompli. Only if I paid him the money there and then would he launch Bel Air. So I had no choice but to sign a promissory note for the money that I had already paid to Sadko. Needless to say, I was livid, but I had to get Bel Air in the water and away from there. Caterpillar had set the condition that one of their engineers should be on board when we launched, and I watched my Bel Air gliding gently into the water the 13th of June 2006 at 11:07. I shall never forget that day. The picture is engraved in my mind. While Bel Air sailed the 15 kilometers to Bodrum, the engineer checked that the engines were set and working correctly, and I booked a mooring in the port of Bodrum. The euphoria of the launch was short-lived. As we anchored, Captain Kara informed me that we were taking water in through a hole just under the inside of our dirty water tank. I phoned around along the coast to find a port with a 100-ton lift. I found the lift in Turco-Trees, 1 hour sailing north of Bodrum, and we went straight there. Bel Air was lifted out of the water, and in the meantime I had arranged for a mechanic to meet us and welding closed the hole. The problem solved, it had been yet another worrying experience when I had to find a solution instantly. After 2 years of construction, I now had to prepare myself for further problems. So after a veritable confrontation with Sadko on the quayside, who refused to hand over the certification, the license, and the passport for Bel Air, I instructed Captain Kara to lift anchor immediately, not knowing where to go. After conversation with the captain, we set course for the idyllic Caracas-Sogut Bay, situated at the bottom of the Gulf of Gokova. 4.5 hours sailing from Bodrum, and I decided to anchor Bel Air there for the winter 2006-2007. Well on our way, we had a wonderful theatrical company of lovely dolphins, displaying all their skills along the side and in front of the bow, as if they were throwing us the way. Realizing that it was Sadko's intention to control Bel Air, so without the ship's papers, I had to react fast. Upon our arrival in Caracas-Sogut, I rented a car in Marmaris and drove back to Bodrum, where I contacted my accountant, who called a customs captain in Izmir. He informed us that all the money that I had transferred during the construction must have been declared to the bank by Sadko as payment for the boat. And if they had not declared it, then for a fee of 3,000, he would drive to Bodrum and present Sadko with a fine of 80,000 euros unless they handed over the ship's document to me within a week. Needless to say, I got all the documents 6 days later. The tale will have it that the Egyptian queen Cleopatra had met with the Roman commander Antonius on the island, swimming together in the bay. We found the ruin of an ancient Greek theater, so there may be some truth in the story. Who knows? I took a photo of my brother with his wife and my daughter, Celine, sitting in the theater. Still, my real-life thriller did not end there. At first, Captain Kara had seemed reliable enough, but again I was proven wrong. In the spring of 2007, I received an invitation from the mayor of Marmaris to use Bel Air for an inauguration party in the Bay of Marmaris, offering that they paid the expenses of the diesel and a fee for 1 day sailing and all expenses while anchored in the bay. The event took place as planned, and the following day I arrived by plane. I asked Captain Kara to come with me to an agency in Marmaris that I had an appointment with. Meanwhile, I told him to go to the bank and collect 15,000 euro that I had transferred for payment of salaries to the crew and some works to be done on the boat. Returning from the bank, he said that he had lost the money. Astonished, I gave him to Monday morning, and after he left, I asked my sailor to take his belongings, look for his license, and if he did not return by Monday morning, to throw overboard all except his license. He did not come back, so I took his license to the yacht agency in Marmaris, and they sent out an alert to all the ports on the Turkish coast that Captain Kara had disappeared with 15,000 euros. Finding myself in the Bay of Marmaris with one young sailor, I called an agency in Bodrum, and they sent me a temporary captain who came and sailed Bel-Air back to Bodrum. And later I heard that he had boasted getting away with stealing the money. Honestly, it was like a real life thriller. Anyway, I started taking charters from the spring of 2007 through 2008. And after 2 more Turkish captains since launching Bel-Air, I finally found a young, reliable and good captain in 2008 that continued to be captain on Bel-Air for 13 years, and he has continued to work for the new owners. I continued to charter out Bel-Air, and in the summer of 2008, we sailed Bel-Air up to Athens through the Corinth Canal to Corfu. A great experience. I had Russian friends who bought 50% of Bel-Air, and having paid 3 times as much as stated in the original contract, I needed to recuperate at least half of the money. This arrangement carried on for another 2 years, when in 2010 the Russians bought the other half of Bel-Air. In 2012, I sold Bel-Air on behalf of them to a German client who continued with my young captain. That is the end of the story about the most challenging and eventful project of my life. When in trouble, you sink or you swim, and I had to swim very fast. And as you saw from the start of this film, I did not drown, but succeeded in spite of extremely difficult circumstances, 2,000 kilometers from home, and dealing with a Middle Eastern culture. Could I have set myself a more difficult task? I don't know. But what I do know is that I gained a vast experience, and participating in the Bodrum Regatta in October 2007 with a crew of 12 sailors, we finished number 25 out of 100 boats, and I can assure you that there's nothing like racing along at a 45-degree angle with a strong wind behind us in baking sunshine, smelling the salt hitting your face head on. There are as many opinions about music as there are people. I will straight away quote Plato, a central figure of ancient Greek philosophy, born 423 and died in 348 BC. He once said, "Music gives wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything." To those wise and inspirational words, I will just add, music has simply been a natural and influential partner since I was about 18 months old, when my mother, who graduated as accomplished pianist from the Copenhagen Conservatoire, planted me daily on her piano stool. My active engagement with music has been from I was about 4 to 14 years old, a short period in 1984 to 1986 as manager of a Swedish pop group, and from 1994 when I founded my classical label Bel Air Music, which are still trading today. My mother taught me to play the piano from I was about 4, and later I had a private teacher until I was 14. I will always remember the last piece I learned, the Mozart Piano Sonata number 16, that I later taught exactly the same piece to my children. This period was never wasted, as music was always there in the back of my mind while motor racing took over. At the time, Copenhagen had become a sort of melting pot for international jazz musicians. They liked to join in jam sessions after their concerts, so I started a jazz club together with a Danish jazz musician, and we had many of them coming to play after their concerts. Having established a successful professional career, now living in England and having time to experiment with management of a pop group, and through a UK record company, I was put in touch with a Swedish trio calling themselves Feg, who was looking for a UK manager. They had just had a #1 hit in Italy, so I went to Stockholm to meet them. We signed a contract in 1985, and I set to work. After 3 months, I'd secured a publishing contract and a record deal with Warner Brothers, only to receive a call shortly after that the trio had split up. Still, I signed the girl Rika to do a demo tape for Warner Brothers. We recorded in Dave Gilmour's Pink Floyd studio with Anthony Moore as producer and Nick Griffith as sound engineer. A family travel around the world was now on the cards, and music was again put in the background until 1994, when it finally became my permanent occupation, which I had always wanted it to be. I took a stand on the first property exhibition in Moscow in 1994, and among others, a young Russian couple visited my stand. We immediately struck up a good relation, and I remember clearly it was the 19th of June, 1994. The following year, they invited me over to their wedding in October 1995, and on the table in my hotel room, I found a brochure about the Russian National Orchestra. Following my return to Monaco, I found myself having booked 7 of major classical works. There were one snag, however. The Russian National Orchestra and the conductor, Mikhail Pletnev, had a contract with Decca. However, typically Russian, the manager suggested that we change the name to the New Russia Orchestra, and we hired the Bolshoi Theater conductor Andrei Chistyakov. So in fact, my first recordings were performed by the best orchestra in Russia under another name and conductor. Now I had to quickly find a name for my record label, and as I had just sold Chateau Bel Air in the southwest of France, the name Bel Air Music came naturally to me. I went to Moscow in November 1995 to be present at the recordings and learn the ropes of my new adventure. I received the digital master tapes in December 1995, and the 7 CDs in January to March 1996, receiving excellent reviews in the UK. During the recordings, I made friends with the first solo violinist, Alexei Bruni, who introduced me to his American friend Elizabeth Hammonds, that 3 years later arranged a series of recitals in Oklahoma with the two pianists Andrei Pisarev and Pavel Nersessian, who had performed on my first recordings. Meanwhile, in 1998, I was invited by the Russian Academy of Science to talk about the new audio file format MP3 at seminars in Moscow and the Polytechnic Institute in Kiev, Ukraine. Having researched it, not only did it reduce the file size to 10% of the WAV format, but also made it easy for people to create their own playlists. Realizing that classical CD sales had topped about this time and was declining slowly, perhaps I had started my label a bit late. Later in 2000, Elizabeth Hammonds had put me in touch with the pianist Valery Kuleshov, prize winner in the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition in New York in 1993, with whom I recorded Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, and later he performed it live in St. Petersburg the 13th of June 2000. Kuleshov is here performing the last bars in the third and final movement of the Concerto number 3. Having always loved organ music since I was about 12, sneaking into my village church, Torbæk Kirke, after school, listening to the organist practicing. In Moscow, I was introduced to one of Russia's leading organists, Ekaterina Melnikova, with whom I agreed to make a recording of 3 Handel organ concertos and her own transcription of Camille Saint-Saëns' Carnival des Animaux in the Cathedral of Monaco in 2000. And upon completion of the recording, a thank you letter from His Highness Prince Rainier III. In November 1999, I discovered the great Russian film music written by top composers like Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Khataturian, and Taiverdiev, etc. At the time, this music was sparingly recorded in the West, so at once I did my first Russian film music recording of A Couple in a Cafe by Mikhail Taiverdiev that fascinated me especially. I got in contact with Taiverdiev's widow, Vera, who gave me permission to record it among 16 other Russian film music soundtracks, and the CD was released in January 2000. It was an instant success, receiving 5-star reviews, and was followed up by further 7 recordings until 2013. I had certainly found a niche that helped the CD sales. Later on, I created and recorded 2 Russian film music double albums, Both albums has about 20 to 24 film music tracks on the CD, and uniquely on the DVD they have the short film clips with my high-quality recorded tracks replacing the original film's low-quality soundtracks. By coincidence, really, in 2000, another special addition to the Bel Air Music catalog was my discovery of a practically unknown Italian composer by the name Aldo Finzi. My conductor friend Dimitri Jablonski had called, telling me that he was to conduct a concert in the cathedral in Porto Gruaro, just north of Venice, and he suggested that I drive over from Monaco to join him. I stood in the right vestry of the cathedral when the concert started with a short overture called Nunquam Sinfonia Romana. My ears pricked, and after, the conductor, the pianist, the orchestra, and the composer's son, Bruno Finzi, all sat down to a late dinner in the piazza behind the cathedral. I sat opposite Bruno Finzi, and during the meal, I spontaneously asked him, "Would you permit me to record Nunquam?" He was very pleased and said, "Yes, by all means." That is how I discovered Aldo Finzi, and since Bel Air Music has recorded all his major works. The music of Aldo Finzi was selected as Discovery of the Month in the Classical FM magazine in 2003, and his music is now performed worldwide in places like Carnegie Hall, New York, etc. Finzi also wrote the comic opera La Serenata al Vento, which inspired the Croatian filmmaker Sanela Bajdrić to make a documentary called Serenade to the Wind. I thought at the time, here we are after so many years. This opera had been lying dormant, and here it was, for the first time, introduced for us. Music crosses borders, make people join rather than separate. Talking about opera, I published another rare opera by the name Catherine versus Sohn Libra by Eric Wolfgang Kongold, performed live at the Marseille Festival Musique Interdite the 8th of July 2014. During the past 10 to 15 years, I have worked with the Serbian international concert pianist Mira Jevtić. Here is an excerpt of her performing the last bars of Rhapsody for Piano and Orchestra. I have been lucky enough to work solely with music over the past 27 years, publishing a total of 74 titles that are all available for download from the iTunes Store and or in Apple Music. So, finally at 85, it is now time for me to hang up the baton, so to speak. Classical music was never the most profitable among my many activities, but I can assure you that it has given me a rich life with many friends and unforgettable memories that will last a lifetime. and I would not change it for the world. Music has been my loyal companion through thick and thin, so I will herewith say farewell with a quote by my favorite composer, Sergei Rachmaninoff. Music is enough for a lifetime, but a lifetime is not enough for music.